Hi everyone, my name's Rich Nosworthy. I'm a freelance 3D artist. You can find me at richnosworthy.tv. I've been thinking about trying to get back into making tutorials again recently, and I thought I'd start with making one about Blackmagic Fusion. It's a great node-based compositing tool. It's very intuitive, but there's not a lot of up-to-date training out there. I've been using it for a little while now, mostly to just assist with grading 3D renders, doing multi-pass compositing, and general comp work. It took a bit of time to get started with, and as with any new package, there's a lot of small things you need to know how to do before you can jump in and start using it day to day. So I thought I'd put together a kind of collection of tips of the basics of working in Fusion. Now I'm no expert, and there's still a lot of areas of the program that I haven't even touched yet, such as its 3D tools and its particle tools and things like that. But my background in compositing was from Shake and Nuke, and so this is just me trying to translate those workflows I used to use into Fusion. This video isn't going to cover doing full multipass comps just now. I'll probably do a separate one on that, but this is just a quick start guide of sorts. Also, I'm not saying that this is going to be the right tool for everyone. It's not going to replace After Effects. After Effects I think is still definitely better for pure motion graphics work, with all its plugins and tools. But when it comes to compositing multipass, doing roto, or doing finishing work on 3D renders, I kind of prefer to use a proper node-based compositor. It's the same if you were using Nuke. You wouldn't necessarily try to do a motion graphics piece in that, but for comping it's great. Fusion is free if you want to try it, which is nice, but it does have some limitations, such as a limit on image size, use of plugins and things like that. But even the full studio version is $300 now, so it's actually pretty reasonable for what it is. Now, apologies, I've not got a lot of experience with making tutorials, so there's probably going to be a lot of editing in this, as I can't seem to record for more than about 30 seconds without making a mistake, but hopefully it won't be too bad. And so I'm not going to get into all the basics of node-based compositing here. This is more just like a quick start guide, as I said, so it's more for people who know about node-based compositing. I want to quickly get started in Fusion. I will, however, show a quick overview of the basic idea though, just to get things going. So in this first example, don't worry too much about trying to follow along. This is just a very quick sort of example workflow to kind of demonstrate the idea of using nodes, but we will go back and sort of focus on the different areas in more detail later on. So first thing that's worth knowing is if you press F4 in any window, you get full screen. Useful one to know. I'm going to select all of this and just press delete. Down here I've got a node called a background node. If I view that on the viewer, this is basically the equivalent of After Effects' solid layer. Up here, if I view this one, this is just a text layer, just got Fusion in it. I'm going to take the output of this text layer, drag it down onto this background layer, and Fusion will create this merge node. And what this does, if I just view the output of this, is it's just doing an A over B, so we're putting the text over the background. Next I'm going to add in a transform node. Shortcut key is XF. I'm going to take the output of this, drag it onto the transform. I'm going to view that. I'm just going to go up here and choose flip vertical. I'm going to drag it down just a little bit. I'm going to take the output of this transform and I'm going to drag that over the end of this merge node. And if I view the output of this one, what we've got here is basically the background with the text merged on top of that, and then a copy of this text again merged on top of that, but with this transform applied. Now I could also go here and add, say, a blur node. I can increase the blur size there. So the nice thing about this, if I go up here to the text node and I start editing this, so you can see all this stuff is actually live. So as I make changes, it ripples down through the comp. Now in After Effects you'd probably pre-comp this to achieve the same thing, but the nice thing about node-based compositing is that you don't need to bother with pre-comps. In fact, every sort of single node can be its own pre-comp if you just wire it up to a different part of the graph. It's also very good for organisation. You can see every step of your comp from the top level, and the effects are just single nodes here. So when you change something at the start, it ripples down through the graph and updates everything. So that's the basic idea. Next I'm just going to go back to the start and begin with the interface. So this is the interface when you first start it up. You've got a viewer here and here. You've got a tool palette over on the right hand side. This is where you'll adjust the settings of your tools. Down here we've got a flow graph. This is where you'll set up your nodes, arrange them, and kind of build your comp. We've also got a few other options here, a console, a timeline. This is useful for sort of shifting the offset of your sequences and things in the comp. And also a spline editor, which is where you kind of want to tweak your animation curves and do that kind of thing. We've got the timeline below that, some play controls. Up on the top left here, we've got a couple of options here for adjusting the look of the interface. You can see you've got 2 panes at the moment. You could have it as one, which I normally like to work with. We've also got some shortcuts here to some of the tools. Down below, you can see we've got a background node. If I just drag this one up, this puts it into the first viewer. As I said before, the background node is kind of like a solid color layer in After Effects. The other way you can do, if you press the 1 key, you can see it toggles sending the output of that to the viewer. You get a little white circle here, and so that's basically saying this node is being sent to the first viewer. To add a second one, I can right click on here, add tool, creator, background. It's going to create a second one there. If I press 2, that's actually going to put a little dot into the second set of circles, and that's just saying send this to the second viewer. I can choose a color over here, just click pick, click OK. We've also got a few other options for that. We've got gradients, both directions, 4 color gradient, and also this one here, which is pretty useful. It's kind of like the ramps effect in After Effects. So you can do linear ramps, reflection, square, cross, radial. I've also got some other quite cool effects for things like repeat, offset. You can create some pretty weird effects for that. Okay, so I'm just going to delete that. First most important thing is how do you bring in images. You're going to need what's called a loader node. There's a few ways to add that. First you can come up here to the shortcuts and there's an LD button. If you click on that, it'll load in your image sequence from there. You could also right click, add tool, IO, loader. My favourite way of adding tools is to just press shift and spacebar, and then you can just type the sort of node you're looking for. If I type loader, you can see it pops up there. There's also in brackets the shortcut, so if I just type LD and press OK, you can just load in some footage. It's going to press 1 to load that into the first viewer, and I'm going to go up here to the controls here and just set this to be a single viewer on the top. The other way you can load in an image sequence would be just to drag it from a file browser, so that's a really quick way of getting things in. So this is just a very simple PNG sequence. It's just 8-bit sRGB. It's about 100 frames. Down at the bottom here you can see we've got the timeline. At the moment it's going from 0 to 1000, that's our total working range. And we've got here 0 to 187, which is just kind of like the render range, which is what we'll be rendering. This image sequence itself is actually 100 frames long. What you can do, if you right click on this, you can just do set render range, or you could drag it onto the timeline and it will just snap that. Under the timeline here, you can see we've also got the sequence there, and you can drag this left and right to kind of offset it in time. Just undo that. So this image sequence is just a quick render from Cinema 4D and Redshift. It's just a simple camera move, slight move on the objects themselves. Over here in the loader node on the right, you can see we've got the file path here. We've got a trim in and trim out if you wanted to adjust which part of the sequence you're using. We've also got a reverse for doing the opposite, and a loop as well, which can be quite useful. So first thing we might want to do is maybe add a bit of color correction to this. If I just select the file loader here and press shift space, type CC, which is the shortcut for color corrector, press OK. I'm just going to go and press 1 on the keyboard here, so we set that to the current tool in the viewer. This is kind of like what I use for most of my color correction. You can see here we've got a few things. We've got colors, we've got levels, for doing levels adjustment. There's a histogram as well, and a spill suppression. I don't really use these too much, all the levels. I mostly just sort of stick to the colors at the moment. We've got a master control here, which kind of just tints the overall grade of the thing. You can reset all colour changes here. We've also got controls for hue, saturation, contrast, gain, gamma, that kind of deal. If you press the little circle here, it just resets it to the default position. This is true on all nodes, it's quite useful. But we can also go in and adjust all these things on a shadow, midtone and highlights level. So for example, if I was to go here to the shadows, maybe I want to tint that a little bit blue. Go to the midtones perhaps, add a slight bit of sort of more teal in there. Maybe the highlights, we make it a little bit warmer. Could go down here, say maybe take the highlights again and just boost the contrast slightly. Maybe take the overall master, lift the gain a little bit, bring down the gamma, that kind of thing. So how do we know what the shadows, midtones and highlights represent? Well, if you go over here to ranges, you actually can set this up. At the moment we're set to result, and what that means is you're just going to see the result of the node. If I go here to shadows and click on that, what it's basically showing you is kind of like a mask of what you're going to be color correcting. So the white bits are going to be full strengths, the dark bits are not going to be affected at all. That's the shadows, it's the midtones there, the highlights are just there. Maybe I want to adjust this a little bit, maybe have a little bit more in the highlights, so I can just drag this bit. And if I drag this over like this, and this one over like this, we're actually bringing a bit more sort of into the highlights. Again, with the shadows, I might want to tighten that up a bit and go this way. Do I want to go this way? I don't know. Something like that. The midtones kind of is everything else in between. So when you're done with that, you go back to the result and your correction, and you can do more tweaks from that. Another nice thing you can do up here is you've got these little S1, S2, S3, etc. And you'll find this in a lot of nodes, and what these basically do is it kind of creates alternate versions. So if I was to press S2 now, it's going to take whatever was in S1 and kind of copy that into S2. We can go here and we can adjust, say, maybe add some more contrast. If I press S3, it's going to take the current value of S2 and maybe we want to put another grade on it, something horrible like that. But you can see the point. Now we've got a couple of sort of states of this node set up that we can scroll through. Up here, you've got a little cross button. If I click on that, it disables the node. You can also press Ctrl P on the keyboard to do the same thing. And under options, not options, sorry, this little one here, we've also got a blend. Now this is pretty cool because it means you can just sort of, it's like a global fade between completely off, completely on. So next, I'm going to add a transform to this. I'm going to hit Shift Space. Type transform. You could also type XF, press enter. If I just press 1 on the keyboard here, we're going to focus our view on the transform node. I can move it around the screen with this. I could rotate it here, scale it. What I'm actually going to do, just reset that for now. Where are we? Set to default. I'm going to scale it up a little bit. And one other cool thing you can do with these all nodes is if you go to this checkbox again, this little tab, sorry, you can actually select which color channels it's actually active on. So if I deselect red and green, this transform is now only affecting the blue channel. This is quite useful because it kind of is a way to do a sort of fake chromatic aberration kind of effect. If I were to set this down to say 0.05, just keep it really minimal, you can see we're just getting a very sort of slight fringing over here. I'm actually zooming in on the image here just by pressing the plus and minus keys. So that's before, that's after. Might even want to take the blend down slightly just to blend it in. Next I might add a glow. Keep it pretty subtle. I'm going to change the apply mode to threshold, which kind of just applies it to the highlights here. Finally, the thing we want to use to output this would be a saver node. So I'm going to hit Shift Space, type save, save a node there. And this is basically going to tell you where you want to output your renders to disk. I could say just output this as a PNG sequence, hit save. I'm not going to replace that, so we'll just give it a slightly different name. And up here you can see we can actually output a variety of different formats. PNG files is one. OpenEXR, things like that. So I could also output, say, an MOV file. That changes the output format here to QuickTime Movie. If I go up to Format here, you can see we've got a variety of different compression types. We've got an H.264, we've got things like DNX HD, uncompressed. We've also got Apple ProRes, which is pretty cool. It means that with Fusion Studio you can actually output ProRes on a Windows machine natively through Fusion. When you're ready to output, you just go down here to Render, hit the Render button. You've got Preview settings, which you could set, say, third, quarter size. I'm just going to leave it on Final, which is high quality, full size, everything. And if I hit Start Render, it will basically go through and write this out to disk. So I've actually got another version of the comp over here which I've set up before. And I've got a couple of saver nodes in here, and this is kind of a good key concept as well, is that you can have more than one saver per comp. So up here what I've got is, here's the original comp. I'm actually resizing it with this node down to a much smaller file size. Image size even. And I'm outputting that as a JPEG sequence. Down below that, I'm taking the original render and I'm outputting that straight to a ProRes movie. And I'm also filing it into one more down the bottom here, which is a H.264 MP4. So if I go down to the render button now, just hit Start Render, you can see it's going through and it's kind of just calculating all these different outputs. You can see whichever node's being rendered at the time flashes green, and it's done. In terms of setting that up for the green render indicator, you just right click here, Options, Full Tile Render Indicators. It's not on by default, but I actually quite like to have that on as it shows what's taking time in your comp. And if we go down here to the output, you can see we've got the JPEG sequence, MP4, ProRes right there. One other option I forgot to mention that I quite like to use is an alternative for doing the chromatic aberration. Instead of using a transform, you could also just go in and use a radial blur. If I just zoom in here so we can see the end result, type in here, type blur. We actually want a directional blur. I'm going to pipe the output of that into this. Click 1. Change it to radial, change the length a little bit bigger like this, and if I now go up here and I just select that as blue again, you can see we're getting a bit of a sort of all-round fringe. It's a slightly different look, but like I say, there's kind of more than one way to do these things, so it's another option that I quite like to use. So that was kind of like a very basic, simple workflow. I did want to go back and just talk a little bit more about some more basic interface stuff now. I'm just going to delete these. Down here in the flow window, if I right click, you can actually move it around. Middle and left clicking zooms in and out. You can see once you go beyond the edge of the frame, you get a little viewport indicator here, so you can drag it around like that. These controls also work up here at the top in the viewer. If you middle click, you drag the window around. Middle and left click zooms in and out. You can also use the plus and minus keys to zoom in and out like that. There's also Control 1, which does 100%, and Control F, which fits it to the view. Down here again, at the moment I've got orthogonal lines between these nodes. If you right click here, go to Options, you can choose Direct Pipes if you wish. We've also got Arrange tools to grid and to connected at the moment. If I turn off to grid, you can actually place it more wherever you want. It will snap to the node behind it, but I generally keep the grid on. So just a little note on nodes and connections. If I select these two and drag them up here, I'm going to put the mouse over the end of this connection here. It turns blue. If I click it, it disconnects it from the flow. I can do the same over here. The output of any node is normally this little red box here. You can see down below there's a little tooltip that says Loader 1 output. Color corrector's got the same thing, color corrector 1 output. To reconnect them together, you just simply drag from here and drop it onto the corresponding triangle. But how do you know which one's the right one? Well, usually the input is this little yellow one. This blue one at the bottom is the mask. This one here has a green one, which is specific to the color corrector, and also a white one which is also specific. Different nodes have different inputs, and sometimes it's a bit hard to remember which one is the right one. Until you get to know, the easiest way to do it is either press Alt and drag over the actual node itself, and when you let go you'll get a little drop down box, and I want to choose input. The other way to do it, which is kind of quicker, is just drag onto it, and as you hover over the different arrows, in the bottom left that little tooltip shows the different connections. So I'm going to drag that onto input and let go. Let go, like that. I'm going to connect this one into the transform as well, and you can see we're now viewing the end of this here. As I said before, you can disable a node by selecting it and pressing Ctrl P. You can see we've disabled the color corrector now, so we're losing the color correction from our comp. Press Ctrl P again to re-enable it. Incidentally, if you press Ctrl P over a file input and press it again, it actually reloads it from disk, which is a useful one that I didn't know for a while. If you want to remove a node from the flow, you simply can press Shift and drag it off, and it takes it out. To put it back in, you can simply hold Shift again and drag it over the line. When it goes that little blue and yellow color, just release and it inserts it back into the node, back into the flow, sorry. Sometimes it helps to redirect the flow of these little connections as well. If you hold Alt and click on one, you actually create a little null dot, and what you can use this is to actually pipe into other connections. It's just used really for kind of ease of use and making things a bit clearer in your comp. Quite a good one to use as well. Back up to the viewer. As I said before, we can have multiple viewers like so. You could have the input, say, on that one, the output on that one. However, you can also have multiple viewers in each viewer itself. There's like an A and B buffer. So at the moment you can see we've got A selected. So if I drag this one onto that, that's got the A buffer. If I press the B one, you can see there's nothing at the moment. Say I now take the glow and drag that one up here. We're now viewing the end of this comp in this one. So you flick between A and B, and you can sort of do an A-B compare. Shortcuts for these are comma and period on the spacebar. You've also got this one in between. If you click on that one, you get a little dividing line. You can move it around. Click on this one to rotate it. That's nice for just doing a little A-B wipe. Shortcut key for that one is the /, which is next to the comma. So, comma, period, /. Down here, you can see we've got a few different viewers. If I click on this, we've got a histogram. You can change between the different ones you want. Things like navigator. Waveform's quite nice. You can right click on it, choose whether you want one color, RGB, resize and things like that. Over here, we can choose the different color we're viewing. If I go and make sure we're just viewing the right one here, you can choose them from this. You can also just press red, green and blue, alpha, C for color. Over here, this one's quite useful as well. Sometimes with comps you want to adjust your sort of overall gamma and gain if you're checking shadows or highlights. So just moving this around is kind of like a overall viewer lookup. It doesn't actually affect the comp itself. It won't be rendered to disk, but it's kind of just something you can use just to check your levels and things like that. Clicking it again turns it off. One other thing that's important to cover is your preferences. If we go up here to File, Preferences, you can see we've got two little drop downs here. The top one, Global and Default, will basically controls your settings for new comps. Anytime you create a new comp, it will use these settings. The one below that just kind of governs the settings for the current comp. So a useful one is frame format. If you're setting up a new comp for a new shot and you know, say it's a 1280 by 720, you'd want to set that here. I normally leave this for default at 1920 by 1080, frame rate 25 frames a second, and I normally leave these on 16-bit float per channel. And what this basically means is if I create a new background node or I create a mask, it's going to conform to these settings. So you want to set this up before you start your comp and start putting everything together. So the next thing to talk about is the idea of color depth. Fusion will actually process your comp based on the upstream nodes or the nodes that are at the start of your graph. Over here I've got a background node. It's just a simple gradient going from black to white. Up in the top right you can see it's 1280 by 400 int 8. that means 8-bit. If I hover over the background as well, you can see a little window pops up and it also says depth 8-bit int. So everything after this will be processed to 8-bit as well. If I go to this color correction node and drag that up to the viewer, you can see it's still processing at 8-bit. If I were to bring up the gain quite a bit and the gamma down quite a bit, basically just boosting the contrast. I don't know if you can see this on the recording, but you're actually starting to get some sort of jagged lines, stair-stepping and banding in here. This is sort of typical of the problems you get when you're grading 8-bit images. It's the lowest quality, it's the quickest to calculate, but you can often introduce these kind of problems. So what if you want to fix that? Well, if you go over to the background node here, under image, you can see it's currently set to 8-bit, int 8. If I set this to 16, this is 16-bit, you've now got rid of the banding. Now if I move the mouse around over the image, you can see down here in the little bar that you actually get a readout of what the value is. At the moment over here you can see we're clipping it at 1. That's the thing with 8-bit and 16-bit, is you're kind of clamping to 0 and 1. Trouble with this is if I had another color correction node, drag that one up, if I bring the gain down, you can see we've actually lost some of the value here, and now this has all been clamped to this lower value. So we've lost some of the range from doing these corrections. So if you go back to the node here, you could actually choose one of two. You've got float 16 and float 32. If I hit float 32, you can see we now get our range back. And even more so, as I drag the mouse over it, you can see we've got ranges that go beyond sort of 0 and 1. Now, this is really good for grading because it means you don't really lose any of your color range while you're sort of adjusting the tonal balance of your image. Float 32 is the slowest to calculate. So there's also this other option called float 16. It's slightly less precise, but it still gives you full sort of like a color range that goes beyond 0 and 1, still floating point. To be honest, this is what I use for most of my stuff. I've never really needed to use float 32. Perhaps if you're using really strong values, you might need to, but I've never come across it. So when you create a node normally, it comes in on this default setting, and what this means is it will just use the value that we set here earlier. Under preferences, under global and default settings, frame format, color depth here. So I set this to 16-bit float, and then every one of these backgrounds that I bring in will use the default value, which is the same as 16-bit float. If you used renderers as well, 16-bit float's also called half float, and if you're using sort of OpenEXR, it's a really good way of getting like that color depth, the color range, but also not having huge file sizes, so that's kind of like my preference for that. Down over here, I've got my render from earlier. This was actually just an 8-bit render, as I said. Normally I wouldn't do that. I'd normally render at half float, float 16, just to get better range. But even if you have just got an 8-bit render, it is actually worth maybe setting your input settings to be something higher. So if you are using a lot of color correction, you're not going to introduce that banding. So if I go here to the input here, under the depth, you can see it's come in at 8-bit int. So I would probably set this to float 16 anyway, and that just means as I color correct things, even if I'm dragging the values up and down a lot, you're not going to lose the kind of values that were there originally. The other way to do that, sometimes you don't always want to do this at the start, is you can use a node called the change depth. Shortcut CD. And in that one you can actually just change, you can either keep the current depth of your stream, or you can change it. So it's quite good for sort of changing your depth during your graph. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the idea of using like a linear workflow in Fusion. In the first example we were using an sRGB color space, Gamma 2.2. This is fine, you can definitely get away with it. In fact, a lot of motion design stuff that you do in After Effects is often going to be 8-bit sRGB. But when you're dealing with sort of multi-pass 3D renders, and if you're say blending your diffuse and your reflection passes and things like that, you actually need your color functions to blend together correctly. And the only way to really do this is to work in linear space. The good news is Fusion actually makes it really easy to do this. It kind of works in linear anyway by default. You just need to set up a few settings when you load your files in, your files out, and your viewer lookups. So this is just a quick render I did of a bike concept sort of thing, done in Cinema 4D. If I go over to Cinema 4D here, you can see the scene file. It's a fairly simple setup. It was just like a chrome shader, a couple of area lights with different textures on to give it kind of an interesting reflection. If I go up here to the render settings, you can see I'm rendering OpenEXR, half float. Like I said before, this is a really good way of rendering OpenEXRs. Basically, you get the full range that goes beyond 1, but at the same time you get smaller file sizes than, say, using full 32-bit float. In fact, often the file sizes are pretty similar to sort of like a 16-bit PNG, but you get far greater range. So that's that. Under the picture viewer, here's the result. I'm going to go over to Fusion now. I've got this loaded in here. You can see it's coming at 1920 by 1080, half float, float 16. But it doesn't look quite right. And the reason for that is we're actually looking at this in sort of native, the linear color values. And this is fine, this is really what you want. When you're down in the graph here, you want to be sort of doing your color corrections in linear. But we also really want to be able to see what the final result is going to look like. And to use that, we're going to use a lookup table. So up here in the viewer, if I go down to this little triangle, I'm going to select Gamma View LUT. Now I'm going to go down to Edit. Output space, I'm just going to set to sRGB, and it's going to add the gamma. So now when I press this LUT button, it applies the 2.2 lookup. So it's all still working linearly down here, but up here you will sort of seeing the final result. In the file itself, you can see under Import, the curve type is normally set to auto, but even if you set it to space, the gamma space here is none. And for linear files like OpenEXRs, this is exactly what you want. You see the curve here is completely straight. Furthermore, if I go up here over the image, if you look down here on the bottom left, you can see the colors we're getting are actually over 1, so we haven't got any clamping, which is what we want for grading. Now if I take the output of this image node, I drag it onto the color corrector. This is actually pretty much the same setup that I had in the first example. And if I take the output of this color corrector and drag it onto this saver node, this is actually just going to render out a JPEG. Now if I was to render this right now, this isn't actually the result we would get. As I said before, this is just a lookup table, so this is only giving us a preview of what the file would look like. But what the file actually is really going to look like is what it is like here if we turn this off. So this is the result we get. We don't actually want this. We want to bake in this 2.2 color correction at the end of our pipeline basically. So if I go to the saver node here, go to export, under the curve type, you'll see it's probably normally set to keep, but you want to change it to space, and you're going to set the gamma space to sRGB. If I hit apply curve, I drag this to the viewer, you can now see that it's now added the proper gamma correction onto the end of the chain. So you basically load it in, you do all your color corrections, and at the end when it gets saved, that's when you add on the sort of 2.2 gamma. There's another way you can do this as well. If you don't want to use this, sometimes I have had problems with JPEGs, they haven't saved it out quite right. You can also use a node called gamut. Just take that out there, use shift and drag it into the chain there. And this is pretty much the same thing, but you can just put it at any part of your comp. So here I'm going to change the output space to sRGB, and it kind of just does a conversion on the fly during your flow. So this is the way I would basically set up a sort of a linear workspace comp and output it. Of course, the one thing to bear in mind is that the original source footage was OpenEXR, so it was already in a linear format and we didn't have to do anything when we brought it into Fusion. But if you wanted to bring in, say, footage that has a gamma applied already, like sRGB footage, how do you do that? So I'm just going to go here, set the color correction back to the viewer, put the lookup table back on, and I'm going to bring in the footage we used in the last example, this tank footage here. If I send that to the viewer, you can see it's actually looking a lot brighter now. The reason for this is the actual original footage is in sRGB color space, and then we're also applying this lookup table on top. So it's kind of like getting a double correction. Really we want this footage to be in linear space. So to do that, what we're actually going to do is a thing called degammering. If I select the file loader here, go to import, go down to source gamma space, click space, and set the gamma space to be sRGB. I'm going to click remove curve, and it actually converts it to linear. Of course it's looking pretty banded and nasty now, so you probably also want to promote this to say float 16. And now you've basically got sRGB footage degammed, so it's now working in a sort of linearized space, and this can be used in the rest of the comp now. One more thing I thought I would add, of course in that last example I was assuming that the file output here is the final output in your chain. But maybe you want to keep this in an OpenEXR format, maybe you're going to use it in another editor, maybe you're going to bring it back into After Effects for example, in which case you can actually just export, say, any other format you want, OpenEXR for example, and under the space you actually won't want to have anything there, just put none so it's linear again. You can take off the apply curve, doesn't really matter. If I turn off the lookup table, you can see it's still in linear. So you can render this out now as an EXR and you'll still be in linear color space. So next I wanted to talk about masking in Fusion. Masks in Fusion are actually their own separate nodes. If I go in here and right click, go up to add tool, under mask you can see we've got a few different ones we can choose from. You can try these out yourself. For the most part I only use a couple of these day to day, probably ellipse, polygon, rectangle maybe, B-spline, maybe bitmap. I'll start with the easiest one, just ellipse. This creates a node here. If I view this in the viewer, you can see it's just a simple circle. Over here on the control panel you can see we've got a level. This is kind of like the opacity of the mask. We've got soft edge, blurs the whole thing. We've got border width, which you can sort of expand and contract the edges. You can invert it. We've got solid. If you turn that on and then change the border width, you actually get like a stroke along the path. And then we've also got a width and a height. Let me just turn solid back on. You've got a width and a height and an angle. You can also go in here and just actually click on the edges of the mask itself, sort of interactively change it, and move it around. If I send this image to the viewer, and now I drag the mask out of here, and I drag it onto the blue input, you can see it says Effect Mask down in the little tooltip in the left corner, and let go. You can see we're now masking the image using this ellipse. You can go in here, and you can see it's got a green outline, so you can go and refine this further, do a soft edge, that kind of thing. You can also mask effects like this as well. Say we wanted to do a sort of vignette on the whole thing. I'm just going to click here to disconnect it. I'm going to make this go to the current viewer. I'm going to add another color corrector after that. I'm just going to pull down the gain a little bit and maybe the gamma. I'm going to drag the output of this onto the color corrector. And with mask you don't actually have to always drag it onto the little blue triangle. Because it's a mask, it knows that's the correct input to go to, so you can actually just release it over the node itself and it will connect to the mask automatically. So we've now got this actual effect of the color corrector being masked by the ellipse. So again we can go in here, we can refine this. We actually want to invert this to give it sort of a darker edge. Maybe bring it out a bit more. If I just flick between the two, you can see what we've done there. Might even just go and bring this back a little bit. Under the blend, just bring that off a little bit. Also going to do my quick trick of just doing a bit of chromatic aberration on the end. So I'm just going to use directional blur. I'm going to set it to radial. Bring up the length. You can see I did this before, it looked fine, but now it looks actually quite nasty. One thing I forgot to say is I had high quality on down here before. High quality basically is used in some tools to kind of give you the sort of final quality. Without it on, it's sort of more like a preview. It will render in high quality, but if you want to see it now, you just click it on like this. And go up here and disable the red channel. Go back to the controls and just make the length about 0.01. maybe a bit bigger so we can actually see it on this video. Now if I take the output of this ellipse here and I drag it onto our directional blur, we're now masking this effect as well using the same ellipse mask. So both of these effects are being controlled and masked by the same mask up here. And this is kind of one of the key concepts of node-based compositing, is that you can sort of reuse things, drag them around the graph, or one node can pipe into multiple sort of inputs and drive other things. I'm just going to show another quick example that just takes this a stage further, shows you what else you can do with this kind of thing. If I delete these, delete this, I'm just going to create another color corrector, copy and paste that. In the first one, I'm going to tint everything blue. And the second one, I'm going to tint everything yellow, just to kind of demonstrate, make it easy to see. I'm going to create an ellipse mask again. I'm going to drag the output of it onto both of the mask inputs of these. And as before, this mask is now affecting both of these. I'm just going to go here, I'm going to go to Options and choose Direct Pipes. I think it's just going to make it a little bit clearer to see for this example. So what if we wanted to keep the mask the same for this one, but we wanted to say make this one a little bit smaller, maybe blur it, but we still want to use the same overall like sort of shape and position? Well, you can actually just drag nodes onto this connection here, and it will only affect the mask going into this node. If I create what's called an erode dilate node, I'm going to drag the output of this ellipse onto here, and I want to make sure I'm dragging it onto the yellow input. If I drag it onto this one, we'll actually be masking the effect of the erode dilate. So I'm going to drag that into here. I'm going to take the output of that and drag it onto the blue of the color correct. If we look at the result of this, nothing at the moment. I'm going to change the filter to circle. Now if I go to amount and dial it up and down, you can see I can actually expand and contract the mask. If I set this to say 0.05, and you compare it with the original one, you can see we've made it bigger. Maybe I'm actually just going to make it smaller, so I'll make that negative. And now after this, I'm just going to put a blur. Increase the blur size. Just make sure I'm looking at the right node on the viewer. Increase the blur size. So now basically this is the matte that's going into this one, and this is the matte that's going into this one. So when we see the two together, that's the blue, and that's the other one. So hopefully this shows you can still use the same mattes, but you can sort of treat each path differently, and you can get a different effect for different nodes. And of course, if I go back up here, you can still move this around, and it's all live. So the next mask I'm going to talk about is just the rectangle one. Add tool, mask, rectangle. It's actually pretty similar to the ellipse, similar sort of controls, width, height, that kind of thing. You've also got a corner radius, can be quite useful as well. The next one would be mask bitmap. This is kind of like a luma keyer, I suppose. If I take the output of my image here, drag it onto the bitmap node, I'm going to select that. I'm going to go over here to the channel, I'm going to choose luminance. If I go here, press A, you can see the alpha channel. And so this is now creating an alpha channel based on the luminance of the image. You can also go to the low and high, tweak the settings of that. That's also another useful one. The next mask I'm going to talk about is the polygon mask. It's actually like a Bezier spline. If we go here and type polygon, and create that, send that to the viewer with the one key. You can see we've got a little menu icons down the side here. If I just click in the viewer, you get sort of these linear points. If I click and drag, you get sort of more like your typical Bezier spline. Click on the end, completes it. You can select all of these. If I hit Shift L, it makes them all linear. If I hit Shift S, it makes them all smooth. We've got our usual controls over here, things like soft edge. We can make it turn off solid and make it into an actual spline itself using the border width. I'll turn that off. Another cool thing you can do is actually give it sort of like a varying blur around the edges. If I go over here, I'm going to choose this button here. It says make double poly. It's actually going to convert it into a slightly different sort of format. If I press tab a couple of times, you can see now we're getting like a dotted line around the edge. If I now drag out these points, it's actually dragging out like sort of like a feathering edge to this mask. If I go back and press tab one more time, we're back to the original shape. You can see I can move the original points, and this feathered edge will maintain the offset. You can also go down here. If you click this button, you can choose outer polygon to kind of adjust those, and choose polyline to adjust the ones in the middle. Another useful one is called B-spline. Just going to create that. This is basically the same sort of deal, but rather than using a Bezier handles, you're actually creating sort of like a interpolated B-spline. So wherever you click, the curve kind of smooths between them. So it's kind of the same controls as the last one, it's just a different way of kind of creating it.
So the next thing that's useful is the idea of combining these masks together. If I go here and create a polygon mask, I'm just going to go up here, I'm going to create a quick sort of roto outline of the edge of this wheel. I'm going to spend too much time on it, it's going to be pretty rough, but it just gives you kind of like a basic outline here. So there's that one. Now I've actually gone through and I've already created a couple of other masks for this. I've got one up here for the other wheel, the other parts of the bike. So I've kind of separated it into different sections. And it's quite a good idea to kind of break up your roto sometimes into these larger shapes. Certainly if you were going to roto a character, it would make sense to kind of make rotos for the arms, the legs, the head, things like that. Now if I want to combine these all into one mask, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take the output of this one and just drag it into the output of this one. Do the same for this one, same for this one, and same for this one. I'm going to chain them all together and they've actually merged into one big mask. When you connect one mask to the other, you actually get an extra little mode here called paint mode. You can see at the moment it's set to merge. So this is basically taking the previous mask and merging it with this one. If I drag the output of this now onto the image, you can see we've now masked the image. If I just create one more, I'm just going to do a quick rectangle. And I'm going to pipe the output of the polygon onto this one. Just going to go over a couple more of these modes. So at the moment, merge, just merging it. Subtract would remove it. It's useful if you want to cut out part of the mask. Minimum actually does kind of like an inside. It's basically taking the minimum of both of these masks, so it's only going to be white where they kind of overlap. Maximum is also kind of like the same as a merge, so those are the main ones I use. And delete that one again. Now you can also animate these masks. When you create them, it automatically creates its first keyframe. So if I scrub through to another frame here, and I just adjust the mask here, say here for example, you can see we've actually got keyframe animation between the two. If I go over here to the timeline, you can actually see the polygon node here, and we've got our two keyframes which we could retime if we want to. Under the spline, I'm just going to select that to tick it on. I'm just going to press this button to fit the spline to the view, and we've actually got our sort of animation curves here. At the moment it's set to linear, but you could adjust these. Set it to ease or something like that. If you don't want animation, you can just right click down here where it says right click for shape animation. This is on the mask itself, and you could just do remove polyline here. Now there's no animation on this at all, and it'll stay static. You can also right click and choose set key. It's just a useful one to know, but that's the basics of that.
So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of masking is the idea of using something like a multi-map. I've got here a render from the same scene file, and you can often get this from 3D. It'll be like a render where it's just got solid colours for red, green and blue for the different parts of an object, for example. So how would you use this to kind of mask an effect? Well, if I hold over the viewer and I press red, green blue, you can see we've got the different channels. If I choose A for alpha, you can see we've got nothing in the alpha channel at the moment. So we've only got information in the red, green and blue channels. So what we want to do is we want to kind of shuffle one of these colours into the alpha and then use that as the matte. So the way to do this is to use something that's called channel booleans, sorry. The second one here. Press OK. Set that to the viewer. If you've used Nuke before, this is actually very similar to the shuffle node, but it's really, really useful and really powerful. So what we're doing here is you're basically saying how you want to sort of remap the channels. So at the moment it's copying the red to the red, green to the green, blue to the blue. So there's no real change here. The alpha is being copied to the alpha. But let's say we want to copy the red to the alpha. You simply just go here and you select the red. If I press A now for alpha, you can see the alpha for this has now been set to the red channel. If you go down here, take it off alpha, make another color corrector. I just use color correction because it's quite easy to see in the video, but this could be any effect. Set it to like a yellow. Take the output of this, drag it onto the mask of the color corrector, and you can see we're now just basically isolating this part that we had in the matte that was red. You could also say set this to green, and now we're isolating the tires. We could set this to blue, and we've got the bit in the middle there. So this is a really useful concept, and I'm also going to talk a bit more about channel booleans later on because it's a very powerful node, very useful in all parts of compositing. One more thing I forgot to mention, a lot of these masks that I've just talked about actually have little shortcut buttons under the viewer here. You can see we've got like the ellipse one, the rectangle, these two I didn't cover, magic wand, bitmap, and here's the two, the polygon and the Bezier one. So you could just select whichever node you're on, hit for example the ellipse, and now you've masked that. It's just a shortcut to kind of create this sort of thing, but it's also quite a useful one to know. Just a few more things I wanted to go over. Firstly, quite an important one is the idea of how you actually merge one image over the other. So if I go here and I create a background node, send that to the viewer, I'm just going to set it to a red colour, something like that. I'm going to use our ellipse tool to make it into a circle, just masking it. Now if I want to merge this over this one, what we're actually going to use is what's called a merge node. So if I just put down merge, we're going to take the output of the color correction, drag that into the merge background. I'm going to take the output of this one here and put that into merge foreground. If I view the result of this, you can see we've actually put one on top of the other. If you check the merge settings, you can see at the moment we're just doing a normal over operation. We've got different apply modes, things like screen, multiply, overlay, ones you're probably quite familiar with if you used Photoshop. If you want to do an add, what you actually want to do is go down here, set this to over, and change the alpha gain down to 0. This might seem a little bit confusing, but really an add operation is the same as an over, it's just that you don't take the alpha channel into account. So that's kind of like why this is named like this. We've also got a blend control down here as well, so you can just dial it back. The merge node also has a transform handle, so you can actually position this separately if you want, which is quite useful. Now at the moment this background node has the alpha channel embedded because I attached the mask to it. Say we didn't have that, say you've just got the background over the other image. You could actually take this mask and you could drag this into the mask effect mask of the merge node. So it's now kind of doing the same thing. It's kind of like more like a key mask, and it's kind of now this mask is kind of defining where one image is being laid on top of the other. So either or works, it's just kind of a different way of doing it. Another thing that's worth noting, if I just put this one back up to here and make that mask the background and not this. There is another way to create this merge node. You can actually just drag the output of this one onto the output of this one. If I do it right, it creates that merge node for you. So it's kind of like a shortcut there. Next, another useful thing to talk about is the idea of clamping your color values. When you're working in float, you often have values that go above 1. Sometimes though, especially with renders, you might be given something and maybe you've got values that go sort of like way above that. So in this original render that we were using before, I've actually put in an extra area light here and I've kind of over cranked it to make it super bright. So down over here we've got values of sort of like 1, 1.1. Up here we've actually got values that go way above into sort of like the 25 to 30 sort of range. So if I add something like a defocus after this and view that, I'm going to bring up defocus size, bring down the bloom for now, maybe make it an N-gon shaded in, bring up the defocus some more so we can see it, change the lens shape a bit. Now if I bring up the bloom level a bit, you can see these highlights here are actually getting super overblown and getting really sort of clipped on the sides. Everything else isn't looking too bad, but these are way too strong. And if I go here and you look down on the little bar down at the bottom here, you can see that the colour values are actually going up into sort of the 50s or so. So what we really want to do is clamp these values. So when they get passed on to the defocus node, they're not super hot and they're not kind of overblowing the result. Now there's not actually a good clamp function like there is say in Nuke, but I did find recently that you can use something called the custom tool, which is new in Fusion 9. So if I go here and I just create custom, we'll connect that one up. This actually gives you the power to kind of create your own sort of tools using functions. So if I go here to channels, you can see at the moment we've got red expression is R1, green expression is G1, blue expression is B1. So that's just taking the input, splitting out the red, green and blue and setting it to the red, green and blue of the tool itself. You could also set this to C1, C1 and C1. It's actually the same thing as what we had before, but it just means that you can type the same expression here. So it's kind of like the colour value for the red, green and blue coming from the input. You could also put a 1 here, a 0 here, a 0 here. And now what's happening is this tool is putting a value of 1 in the red and 0 in the green and blue. So we'll go back here and we'll put back in C1, C1, C1. Now to do a clamp function, what we really want to do is just do a minimum of 2 values. So we're going to go here and type min, open brackets. This is the original value, so we'll have that for the first one. And for the second one, we're going to type N1 and close the brackets. I'm going to take this, copy this into the green and blue. Now the N1 is actually under controls, and this is the same thing as number in 1. So this is just like a kind of variable slider you can move around. And if you look up here, you can see as I drag this around, we're actually clamping the maximum value. So at the moment we're clamping it really low. Can bring it above 1. So now if I set it to say 2.5, and now we drag the output into the defocus, now you can see the result is a lot less kind of overblown. You can go back into the custom tool, see what it originally was, sort of around 30. It's quite nasty and high contrasty there. Bring it down to say 1.5. You can kind of tweak it like that. So it's good to be able to have this control and say maybe clip some of your highlights in an image somewhere along the way. You do get this quite often in floating point images, so it's quite good to know how to do this. So in the masking section, I kind of briefly went over the idea of keyframing. I just wanted to go over a few more examples just to kind of expand on this a little bit more. Right here I've just got an ellipse mask going into a yellow background, and I'm just merging that over a grey background here. So that's creating what we see here. If I select the background, I'm just going to add transform tool, XF, hold shift, drag that in. The transform tool itself has a couple of little manipulators on screen. By default it's just these 2 arrows, which lets you position it on screen. If you go down here to this little arrow box here, you can actually select a few different other ones. There's a size, that kind of gives you a red border for the outside of the screen. There's an angle. And this one here is pivot. Pivot's quite useful. You see it turns to a little X, and you can actually now adjust the pivot point. So if I was to go here and change the angle now, we're actually going to rotate around this pivot. You can also scroll between these different manipulators by pressing the tab key. So as you see, as I press tab, we go through all the different ones. So I'm going to move this one over a little bit. Now you can keyframe any parameter in Fusion just by going over here and selecting this little bar and double clicking on it. I'm going to go back to the first frame, double click here where it says angle, move forward 10 frames, and I'm just going to hit 360 here, do a full rotation. You can see now, if I move through here, it's animating. You can also use the open and close brackets to go through your timeline. Under the timeline here, you can see under the transform, we've got our 2 keyframes we just made. We could select either of these, retime it, as I said before. I can go to spline, angles selected, and you can see, if I scroll out a little bit here, we've actually got our 2 keyframes here. And this is just kind of like the animation curves for this. At the moment it's set to linear, but I could easily set this to easy ease. Maybe increase the sort of weighting on those a little bit more. We've got linear here, which we just had, stepped. This one here actually reverses the keyframes. This one does repeat. So if I press play now, you can see the animations getting repeated. And this one's like a ping pong, so it kind of does this. Just going to stop that, go back to the start. Go back to the flow window and I select the transform node. You can see under here we've actually got motion blur. If I click that on, and we've actually got motion blur switched on down here. This little button actually enables it in the preview. So if I press play, we're actually getting motion blur on the actual preview as well. And this will of course obviously render in the final render. It looks a little bit steppy at the moment, I don't know if you can see, but if you boost up the quality here, you can increase that. You've also got controls for things like shutter angle, center bias, sample spread and things like that too. So going back over to the main controls, you can actually right click on angle, you can remove a key, you can also do remove transform angle, which will completely delete the keyframes as well. Another thing that's quite good to do is to randomize a parameter. In After Effects you had the wiggle expression. We've actually got a similar thing here in Fusion. If I go here, just create color corrector first, drag that out. I'm going to connect the background here, this little dot, to this one. It's going to change the hue so we've got a different color. Put it on the top of this merge node here. So we've got 2 of them. I'm going to create another transform here. Just shift it over a little bit. If I go up here to the center of this transform node and right click, I can choose modify width. We've got a few different ones we can choose, but perturb is actually a lot like wiggle. If I go over to the modifier tab up the top now, you can see we've got the little perturb function there. If I press play, zoom out a little bit, you can see we're sort of now randomizing the position of this. You've got a scale for the X and Y, so if you just make it X, it's just going to go up and down, opposite with the Y. We've got speed, wobble, strength, that kind of thing. The value up the top here just allows you to kind of offset this. So if you set it to 0, it's going to be over on the left. 1 is over on the right. 0.5 is in the middle. And of course, if we go back to the tools here, we can go to our transform node, select this one, turn on motion blur, and there you go. Just another little useful one to know. This is the very last tip for now. Sometimes it's useful to have 2 nodes in different parts of the graph that actually share the same values. Just for an example here, if I put down a blur, it's going to blur this input here. Or what if I want to add the same thing to this? We can actually instance a tool. So if I click on this and I press Ctrl C and then press Ctrl Shift V, it actually makes a copy, but this one's now called instance. And you've also got this little green line connecting the 2. If I shift and drag this one into this flow here, you can see we're now applying this to the other one. Up here in the parameters, you can see that the little values here have a green checkbox around them. And if I modify one, you actually modify both. So there's like a live link between the two of these. You can also though change this, and if for example you wanted a blend to be a different value but you wanted the other values to stay linked, you can click on the parameter itself, right click and choose deinstance. So now this one over here, you could set the blend to say 0.3. Everything else is still linked together, but this is separate. So it is useful to sometimes have that link between tools in different parts of the graph. And this is pretty much everything that I wanted to go into for this sort of introduction to Fusion. It's just how I use it. There's a bunch of stuff that I still haven't really explored yet. I don't really know how to use. You've got like particle systems, 3D workspaces and things all inside Fusion. Also, I'm still kind of learning this, so if anyone's got any better solutions to the stuff I've shown, maybe just stick it in the comments. It's always good to learn new ways of doing things. And next, I'm hoping to do a shorter tutorial, just going to go over sort of how to put together a 3D multi-pass composite using these sort of techniques, just from the start to the end and that kind of thing. But thanks very much for listening. Hope it's been helpful. Thank you.